what I'm going to try and talk about today is the what and why of active support. I'm sure everybody has now heard of the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is coming very soon, in the next year or so. And the aims of the NDIS are crucially about increasing the choice and control and the social and economic participation of people with disabilities. And these are aims that really aren't new. Those of you who've been around for a long time, they were the aims of the legislation that we passed in Victoria in the middle of the 1980s. And we've been trying to achieve these sorts of outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities for a long time. We haven't really done it very well. If you look at some of the history and some of the research, we've funded a lot of services, and some services have done better than others. And the work that was done for the Productivity Commission in 2011 really came to the conclusion that in Victoria and across Australia, we didn't have enough services to enable everybody to get the type of services that they needed. And some of the services that we were providing really weren't doing their job very well. So some of them were fairly ineffective. And it was particularly the case for people with intellectual disabilities. People with physical and sensory disabilities have come an enormous way and are much more part of our community and have jobs than people with intellectual disabilities, who are still quite left behind in terms of social and economic inclusion. And if we turn to thinking about supported accommodation, the group homes, the type of group homes that you run in your organisation, what's very clear is that there's enormous variability in the outcomes for people who live in group homes. And there's variability between different organisations. So some organisations get really good outcomes and some get poorer outcomes. And they're implementing the same model and it's costing them exactly the same. What we also know too is there's enormous variability between services. Even within one organisation, one group home can be really good and another group home can be not so good. So we have to try and understand why there is this variability. And what we know consistently is that the poorest outcomes are those for people with more severe and profound intellectual disability. They're always the ones that get left behind. And there's been a lot of talk about supported living. So moving from group homes into different types of accommodation. More individual, people living in ones and twos rather than in groups of 4 or 5. People living in rented accommodation in the community and in more ordinary houses. But unfortunately, the research about that too suggests that there's not very good outcomes for that type of support, that type of model either. And so it raises the question about why is there so much variability? And when we say outcomes are poor, we often use engagement as a proxy for that. And I think if you think about your own lives, from the time that you get up to the time that you go to bed, most of you are engaged for between 95 and 100% of the time. Unless you have a snooze in the afternoon, but that's when you're asleep. So most people are generally engaged for most of their waking hours. And engagement can be anything from listening to the radio, watching television, reading a book, talking to other people, doing the housework, all those sorts of things. But what we know from some of our research is that people with intellectual disabilities across the board in our studies are only engaged for about less than half of the time. And that turns out to be about 34 minutes in every hour, which means they're spending the rest of the time doing nothing. And for those of you who can see this graph, you can also see that, and it's by organisation, that in some organisations, some people are engaged for none of the time. And some people are engaged for 100% of the time. So that's the variability that happens. And you have to say, well, why is that? What's happening here? Why are some people so disengaged? And it relates very clearly to the quality of support that people are getting. So we use a measure which is called active support, which is a measure of 15 items that looks at the quality of support that people are receiving. And when you think about it, after all, you're running services, you're employing staff, and the role of the staff is to provide support to the people that are living in those houses or are coming to the day centre. That's the reason you employ staff. That's the reason people with intellectual disabilities need services, because they need support to be engaged and to do the everyday things that the rest of us do generally without support. So again, we see there's enormous variability in the quality of support between organisations. And the research suggests that a good level of support is about 66%. And on average, most of the organisations that have been in our study are still quite a bit below that. The research evidence is really clear that people with more severe and profound intellectual disability are doing even worse. And on average, those people are only engaged for 10 minutes in every hour, which means for the other 50 minutes of their lives, they're sitting doing absolutely nothing. And you have to wonder then, why do people have challenging behaviour? Why do people injure themselves? Why do people poke their eyes, do all sorts of things? That's because they're disengaged and they've got nothing else to do. So I think the reason that we're talking about implementing active support is around these very low levels of engagement, particularly for people with more severe and profound intellectual disability. So the question is then, what makes a difference to outcomes? So how can we get people to be more engaged? What can we do to make it better? This is a summary of all of the research around outcomes in group homes. It tells a really clear picture. It says you have to have the necessary but not sufficient conditions to get good outcomes. So you have to have enough resources. You have to have enough staff, but not too many staff. If you have too many staff, what do you think they do? They talk to each other. So you have to have enough staff, and you have to enable people to live in small home-like settings, in ordinary houses in the community. If people are living in large congregated settings away from communities, then you're not going to be able to get good outcomes, full stop. So you have to have these necessary conditions. You have to have a good external environment that's providing you with funding and that's supportive of social inclusion. And those things are beginning to change in Australia. You have to have an organisation that has particular characteristics in terms of its policies and its processes. So it's got to have strong HR policies about who it employs, the values that the people that are working in your organisation have. And that's policy about how you employ people and how you unemploy people when they're not suitable. You have to have processes that assist staff to focus on good practice and that provide staff with training in active support and hands-on training as well as classroom training. You have to have a good culture in the houses where you're supporting people and in your organisation. A culture that's coherent, so it hangs together, that's enabling of people to be involved, that's motivating for staff, and that above all is respectful of the people that you're working with, that regards those people as adults, as equal human beings who have the same rights as everybody else in our community. But the most important thing, and the thing for which there is actually most research, is about the frontline staff and managerial working practices. The thing that makes most difference out of all of these things is what the frontline staff do, what the direct support workers do. And the evidence suggests very strongly that if they do active support, then that produces really good outcomes. And that you need to have frontline practice leadership to make sure that the staff are doing good active support. We know from quite a lot of evidence you can train staff and you can expect them to behave in certain ways, but they also need to have good practice leadership, good frontline supervision to help them reflect and improve their practice. So there's evidence from 20 years worth of research now that if support workers use active support consistently, that the quality of life of the people with intellectual disability that they're supporting will improve, that people will develop better, that people will have better interpersonal relationships, they'll get on with other people around them, they'll learn communication skills, people will be more socially included, people will have more self-determination, more control over what's happening in their life, and they'll be able to exercise more choice and control. Overall, all those things will mean that their level of engagement increases. And importantly, they'll also have less challenging behaviour. So if you provide good active support, you're not going to need as much specialist extra support to deal with people's challenging behaviour, because you will have reduced it. You'll have built the foundations for a good life. And they will also develop skills. So the main aim of active support isn't to develop skills. The main aim is to support people to be engaged. But a byproduct of doing active support is that people will actually learn more skills and become more independent. And the important thing is that doing active support isn't more expensive. Providing high quality support is the same cost as providing low quality support. So the fact that your funding is the same as the funding for the organisation down the road means that both of you can do active support, or one can choose to do it and one can choose not to do it. It's not going to cost you any more. So it's about how you use the staff and how you train the staff and what you expect of staff. So in summary, active support is a way of providing just the right amount of assistance to enable a person with intellectual disability to take part successfully in meaningful activities and social relationships. It's a way of working with people that you can do all of the time. It's not something you do for 10 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening. It's the overarching practice that you should be using all of the time. It's about people that are being supported to engage in meaningful activities, which can be doing things constructive with materials, vacuuming, laying the table, hosing cars, all of those sorts of everyday things that exist in people's houses. You don't need to go and find activities to do. There's lots of things that have to be done anyway. It's about interacting with people wherever you are, the people that you live with, but also the people out in the community, and trying to make that happen. And taking part often in group activities too, with other people, either with and without intellectual disabilities. So it means it's asking the staff a lot. It's asking the staff to provide help that will enable people to be engaged, so that people can gain more control over their lives, and it works for everybody. We often hear from staff, they say, yes, but we can't do that because the people that we work with are too severely disabled. But we've got a very high amount of evidence that you can do it with almost everybody, There's 4 essential elements of active support, which are really good ways of helping you think about it. There's this idea that every moment has potential. So every moment when somebody's awake, when there's staff members on duty, has the potential to support somebody to be engaged. It doesn't have to be one-to-one engagement. A staff member can support 2 or 3 people to be engaged at the same time. So it's every moment that a staff member is around, there's the potential to provide support for people to be engaged. Staff shouldn't be doing things for people, they should be supporting people to do things with the staff or for themselves. It's also about little and often. So often people who have quite severe disabilities can't be engaged for a lot of the time in one go. They need to do a little bit and then they need to stop and take a break. And often people haven't done things like washing up before, haven't done things like hosing cars before, but people need to try it, just a tiny bit, to see if they like it, and then try it again. And then they'll get used to the idea that this is something that they quite enjoy. So you need to try things out again and again to give people the opportunity to get a sense of this is the thing that they like to do. And then there's this idea which is really central to active support, which is about providing graded assistance, which is providing the right type of support to the person at the right time. So every person has their own individual support needs. There isn't a formula for this. The staff members need to know people really well, and they need to work out the type of support that people need. And that means thinking about both the support that the staff are providing, but how they're providing the right environment, the type of equipment they might have available, the type of communication devices, the type of very simple switches that might enable somebody to control something like a blender because it's too fine for them to control it themselves. So it's thinking about how to provide the right sort of assistance. And that means about the environment, means about speaking to people, using visual gestures, using objects, and sometimes actually providing physical support to people to do things. The other issue is that this is actually a way of getting much better engagement from staff, and staff being more satisfied with the type of work that they're doing. It's very skilled, being a staff member, to be able to stand back and to create the right environment so people can exercise that choice and control for themselves. I think often in the past people haven't been given those options because they couldn't necessarily say, if you say, what do you want? People can't say that, but you can set situations up to give people the chance to convey their choices in lots of different ways. This type of active support it doesn't require paying staff anymore. It means expecting different things of staff and training them and reinforcing what you expect them to do when they're on shift. So not leaving it to staff to choose what they're going to do. It means they need to have good practice leadership so that there's an expectation that in all aspects of their work, they're supporting people to be engaged. And that means you need a practice leader who is actually helping them think about how to allocate and use their time so that they can actually use it as constructively as possible. I've seen staff members come on shift, really not know what they're supposed to be doing, and then start to go round and tidy up because they've just come from home where that's what they were doing for their teenagers. So it's about having a shift leader, having a practice leader who helps to organise and expect staff to do different things, who helps to run team meetings that helps them to reflect on the type of support that they're providing, that runs individual supervision so that staff get feedback about the type of support that they're providing, and that is a good practitioner themselves, so that new staff who come into the organisation not only get training, but also see good practice. They see their practice leader, their leaders, doing really good practice, so they can model themselves on what's expected. In the last minute, I might just, say a little bit about the research that we're doing so you can see how Bayley House is now part of a much bigger endeavour. We've been working with a number of organisations now for the last 5 years, and we've been recruiting extra organisations. And as you can see, Bayley House joined us in 2014-15. So we now have altogether 15 organisations. So we've now got 5 states that are part of our study. And the aim of our study it's twofold. It's to support organisations to develop their practice around active support, and we measure the outcomes and makes you part also of a community of practice of all those organisations who are trying to grapple with much the same thing. But what we're also trying to do is to collect data, a big data set from across Australia and the organisations about what does it take to make active support be embedded within organisations. What is it that actually makes the difference? Is it the training? Is it the practice leader? Is it the culture of the organisation? Where should you put most energy? At the moment, what it's suggesting is that it's training, it's hands-on training and coaching, and it's practice leadership that make the difference to outcomes.